just once.
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to TNT, today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We're in hour number 2 of this live broadcast. Appreciate you guys coming back for the second hour. Hello to everybody in the TNT chat community. Now we're going to pivot over to a very important issue that affects everybody. Now we're going to be focusing on the United States, but of course this affects you globally, wherever you are in the world, with the monopoly that big tech has over the information space, over the global public square. Any technology, anything that's implemented at that level in terms of censorship, speech control, it's being done globally. So this is a U.S. issue, but it's also a global issue right now. To talk about this right now, I want to welcome onto the program Mike Benz from the Foundation for Freedom Online. And Mike has been very hot on this issue for a very long time. We're going to talk about it, its implications if you're in the United States, and what people can possibly do to stem the tide of what is clearly here. It looks like an authoritarian power grab in a technocracy fashion. Mike Benz, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
So, Mike, AI censorship, just as a general theme, is something that frightens a lot of people because it does take the human element out of it. As bad as we saw with the Twitter files, and which you are very familiar with and you covered, and your organization has done great reporting on, this is a whole nother level here. If you can just explain to us where we're at in this process right now.
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is that AI censorship is not some future threat. It's already here. It's already been here for about 6 years. It was the great technological game changer that allowed the modern era of internet censorship to happen. See, before 2016, if political elites wanted to kill a narrative online that was trending or a political movement that they opposed, they would have to hire armies of manual censors and there was not enough to keep up with the evolutionary arms race of the popular political support for narratives they tried to get rid of. So, for example, in YouTube, immediately after the 2016 election, they hired 10,000 new content moderators. It wasn't enough. So they hired another 10,000 new content moderators. It wasn't enough. And what ended up happening was, I call these weapons of mass deletion, the New Manhattan Project, to construct the ultimate AI censorship Death Star to be able to blast the planet of nuisance narratives off the internet. And this technology was initially created by DARPA. It uses a technique called natural language processing, or NLP, which is a machine learning technique that takes every word you say, every sentence you write, every paragraph you tweet on Twitter. It all gets analyzed into a model that ingests what you say and how it relates and how it's spread to the other people in your network. And they create these vast topographical network maps of how a narrative is going viral. So you may have seen some of these. It'll have a picture of a high profile individual and it links out to everybody else who spread that message. And they can create this taxonomy of any narrative in the world, vaccine skeptics, mail-in ballot skeptics, climate skeptics, abortion, energy, migration, you name it. This was initially constructed by the Pentagon with funding from the State Department in order to deal with the threat of ISIS recruiting on Facebook and Twitter in 2014. And so what they did is they basically pulled together these sort of political thought leaders, these national security figures, and then tons and tons of academics and so-called subject matter experts to parse the dialect, the specific words and phrases, the hashtags, the memes, and the prefixes and suffixes, the particular slang and rhetoric of the movement they're trying to target. And then every tweet, every Facebook post, every TikTok and YouTube video, because if we're streaming right now on YouTube or on Rumble, all of this goes into a back-end text-to-speech transliteration that's used for closed captioning, which means all of that's translated into words. So it creates for the national security state a real-time heat map of every political movement and of every trending or emerging narrative that's going on in the world. So it was initially created for those national security purposes. But then after Brexit in the UK and the 2016 election here in the US, when they created this Russiagate predicate, All of that came home, and they turned these weapons of mass deletion to be able to scan and ban any narrative at scale from a foreign national security predicate into a domestic democracy predicate and unleashed it on everyone. This was how the 2020 election was censored. Make no mistake, when the Election Integrity Partnership said that 22 million tweets were misinformation, they didn't manually go through 22 million tweets. The Twitter files covered things like the FBI telling Twitter to take down 22 tweets. Well, that's 6 orders of magnitude from 22 million. The 99% of all content takedowns online originate from an AI toxicity score or an AI hate speech or an AI misdis or malinformation assessment that first flags it to the manual flaggers. And in most cases, manual flaggers have nothing to do with it if the confidence interval in the AI is high enough. And so this is not only used domestically at home to control our own internal affairs. Again, it was rolled out for the 2020 election. It was rolled out for COVID. The Department of Homeland Security began using it for things like misinformation about illegal migration or irregular migration, and for climate change. But the State Department is now using this. And when I say State Department, that means the National Endowment for Democracy. That means USAID. That means our whole NGO swarm of CIA cutouts is now using this to rig every political election around the world. That is this nexus between the State Department and our tech companies and the regional desks at the State Department, who are concerned with picking winners and losers in every election of significance on this planet. They perceive these AI censorship superweapons as being the El Dorado gold mine to be able to stop political opposition everywhere around the world. So it went from being this thing that was a pet project of DARPA to being rolled out domestically, to being this billion-dollar industry for who can create the best artificial AI-powered censorship superweapon. And I'm overwhelmed with joy that finally Congress is seeing the importance of this issue.
Where is Congress on this right now? What is the level of awareness on Capitol Hill? I know we do have some proactive people in Congress that tend to recognize the importance of some of these emerging issues, but what sort of numbers are we talking about here? Or is this really just a loud minority that's keeping this issue elevated?
It's a loud minority for now, and where they are on it is still very, very basic, because the rabbit hole goes so deep on this. I made a mini documentary about this in 2018. That's 6 years ago. And so the level of scale that it is at now is, I'm not disheartened by the general lack of awareness in Congress over this, because the subject matter is deep, it's technical, it spans government, academia, the social sciences, the political sciences, the computational data sciences, a whole web of economic and financial stakeholders. It's a huge topic unto itself, and the initial focus for the past 18 months has been on the censorship industry side of what we're up against and breaking that open. And I'm glad now that has been established unassailably, that we can now move into the sort of deeper elements of the technology of how it all works. But three pretty big things happened yesterday. You had the House Homeland Security Committee hold a formal hearing on AI censorship for an hour and a half, laying out the basics. You had the Jim Jordan, the guy who was almost Speaker of the House, and who's probably number 2 in terms of the power structure of the House GOP. He's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and the subcommittee of that, the Weaponization Committee, published an 80-page report on the National Science Foundation's role in funding the AI censorship superweapons, which is a story I'm proud to say that I broke about 18 months ago, and I'm happy to see this now getting congressional attention. And in addition to that, Congress also filed a subpoena against the National Science Foundation for all of their records, emails, and communications about everything that touches their funding of domestic censorship superweapons. Now, what's really important about the National Science Foundation role here is this was a very difficult task for me personally over the past 2 years, which is that people are used to seeing the FBI. People are used to seeing, the State Department or Pentagon malfeasance, or the CIA or the Department of Homeland Security. But when you say National Science Foundation, people say, well, how bad could it really be? The National Science Foundation? Well, so the role of the U.S. government in the censorship industry is they have something they call the whole of government, a whole society, whole of government structure. Whole of society folds in the private sector companies, the censorship mercenary firms, the universities, and media and fact checking. But whole of government means every government agency now has to lend its own resources into this censorship, whole of government model. And so the FBI will do things like tell the platforms to take down particular posts, and DHS will coordinate on censorship policy with Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. But National Science Foundation provides the funding. You see, the National Science Foundation is not the civilian arm that it holds itself out as. It's basically the civilian arm of the Pentagon. Just like the internet itself started as a Pentagon project and then was handed over to the National Science Foundation in order to have a sort of civilian front to interface with the commercial and informational and political aspects of the internet. Behind it was the Pentagon the whole time. It's the same thing here with the censorship industry. And the National Science Foundation is a $10 billion pot of gold that props up our entire university ecosystem in the US. Let me make this clear. We do not have a private sector free market education system in this country. That is the pretty little face that we hold up to make it look like free enterprise. The number one funder of all higher education research in this country is not the tuition payments. It's not independent donors and nonprofits. It is the U.S. federal government through a little thing called the National Science Foundation. And the National Science Foundation, after the 2020 election, decided that censorship was science, that in order to preserve democracy, in order to preserve the political hegemony of the political forces designed to stop any sort of populist reform in this country, they decided that we needed to supercharge, we need to turbo fund the science of censorship in order to stop the rise of political populism. And so tens of millions of dollars began flowing to these censorship mercenary firms, and that's the capacity that props up the industry. So Congress is now finally, after all these years, over the target of the Achilles heel of the censorship industry, and it's going to be a long fight from here, but I'm glad the fight has started.
Now, I want to back up a couple of things that you said, just to validate some of the points that you made. Those heat maps you're talking about are very real, tracking dissenting speech online. They did this under the guise of tracking disinformation or misinformation. I was featured in some of those initial heat maps at the University of Washington. Kate Starbird is one of the operatives who run that program. That was interesting how that was funded, that whole department. I'd like to get your take on that. And also what you said about elections, Mike, is absolutely spot on. Facebook is one of the global leaders in election censorship. Their former head of trust and safety is a former CIA, long-term CIA agent, Aaron Berman, moved to global election integrity from trust and safety. I mean, so he's, if you have a CIA person effectively in charge of, surveying the global election landscape on that platform, that is a very powerful position, micromanaged from a U.S. tech enclave, but globally. So those things that you're talking about, Mike, are very real, and we can absolutely validate everything that you're saying there.
Well, you mentioned Kate Starbird and the University of Washington. You know how Kate Starbird's University of Washington censorship lab is funded? It's by the National Science Foundation, the very group we were just talking about. Her lab at UW received a joint $3 million grant of U.S. taxpayer funds. So that is money being stolen out of your pocketbook to pay for the people censoring you. So, I mean, $3 million. These people are not running, rocket science labs. They're not, they're not building new renewable batteries. They are literally just reading your tweets and deciding how best to censor you. And that work is being funded by you, the U.S. taxpayer, through the National Science Foundation, which finally Congress has now subpoenaed and held its first hearing on. But again, the rabbit hole in there goes very deep. Kate Starbird's network there is tightly connected to U.S. military and foreign policy interests. It was none other than Michael McFaul, who, so Kate Starbird, of course, comes from three generations of very significant military family and has worked with Fort Lewis there in Seattle. University of Washington is the Bill Gates University. The Bill Gates family has been on the board of trustees for multiple generations of the University of Washington, which is very close to Seattle there. And their partnership with the University of Stanford is exactly over the target of what you just said. You know, that
Alex
Stanford,
Stamos. Alex Stamos, as Stanford Internet Observed, he's former CTO at Facebook, right?
Yes, and not only that, part of his role as CTO of Facebook was during that Russiagate era when he personally interfaced with the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and to censor basically, you know, U.S. Trump supporters under cover of calling them Russian bots and trolls. And who is Alex Stamos's boss at the Stanford Internet Observatory? It's Michael McFaul. Michael McFaul, Obama's U.S. ambassador to Russia, who was kicked out of Russia, who personally authored white papers on how to structure color revolutions. He put a 7-step guide out, and the first step in that is control the media infrastructure. And so then he goes on to head the top censorship, the censorship university for controlling discourse on social media. And who is the top technical operative at the Stanford Internet Observatory? It's Renee DiResta, who started her career in the CIA. So you have these CIA and military and State Department, the blob. Every time you look up, you know, and see who it is who's putting their boot press on the thumb of your speech, it comes from those three webs of the U.S. national security state: our Pentagon, our intelligence services, and our State Department. And you mentioned Aaron Berman there at Facebook. It's the same thing at YouTube. It's the same thing at TikTok. It's the same thing at Reddit. You know, the head of content moderation at Reddit is a NATO blob monster who comes straight from the Atlantic Council, which is 7 CIA directors on its board and gets annual funding from the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Endowment for Democracy. What happened was, after the 2016 election, the national security state and our foreign policy establishment freaked out that the wrong people were winning elections, and they would change U.S. foreign policy to focus on domestic priorities instead of foreign policy. That they would focus on the homeland instead of the empire, and these are the managers of the empire. And so they said, we have lost our capacity that we used to have in the analog media ecosystem to be able to control bad news stories, to be able to put bumper cars on democracy so the wrong people didn't win elections. And so they systematically went about building in the digital era the same sort of relationships they used to have with the editorial desks, the same sort of relationships they used to have with media ecosystems, with social media. And we are now living in the aftermath of that.
So they launder this through the facade of academia to give it some, like, you know, legitimacy, like you said very accurately, I think, is make it seem scientific, make the you know, Glyphy and all these various open API things they use to scrape data down and create these models of disinformation and things like that. NewsGuard is another one, by the way. I think they're very much tied in with the intelligence apparatus there, but it's to give the facade that this, you know, there's some kind of, you know, good work going on here that's very good for society. But what you're saying, Mike, is that all of this is just an extension of the you know, the military industrial complex, the intelligence military industrial complex. It's really just an extension of that, and they've completely weaponized it now, so much so at scale that it can be deployed domestically and internationally with lightning speed.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You know, the analogy that I say here is, I mean, this is exactly how intelligence operations are classically structured. When the CIA got busted during Iran-Contra running illegal narcotics from South America into Miami in order to fund a proxy war in Nicaragua, you know, they didn't have CIA agents wearing with W-2 badges, you know, and saying, "Hi, my name is Edward. I work for the CIA." You know, running the narcotics in. They used front companies like speedboat companies and shrimping companies to run that in. We set up an elaborate web of offshore banks through the Cayman Islands, or BVI, or BCCI back in the 1990s. And we put together a web of foundations and nonprofits, of academia cutouts. You can go on my Twitter right now at Mike Ben Cyber, and if you just type in my handle and look up academia, the keyword academia, you'll see all the times in the past that the CIA has consistently used university centers as a front for intelligence work. and as well as how the structuring of all this is classically done. It fits that to the T. So it's not just the same playbook. It's literally the same players.
It is incredibly disturbing as well how much money also is being allocated to all of this. It's become an industry in itself, much like the defense industry as well. It's become a sort of self-feeding feedback loop where there's people. It's funny, the young people coming up through the ranks, Mike, who listen to all of these panel discussions, who are hooked on this fifth generation warfare narrative that everything is potentially, in the cultural space and foreign influence. Tucker Carlson is getting an earful from these same people for going to Russia to interview Vladimir Putin, and they're saying, well, this needs to be regulated because this is Putin's way of infecting the minds of America. I mean, this is just so ridiculous on such a massive level, but that's where people's heads are right now in a lot of the American political space. I think it's very corrupting, these sort of ideas that have been allowed to fester, especially since 2016. And we're getting to see the result of this, is there's going to be a new generation of people who are buying into this. Well, I'm going to call it garbage, but to the point where they're reclassifying the free press as somehow information warfare. Like literally, that's the whole of society approach that you were talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and it's not just the young people. I actually think the young people have, what you call strong beliefs loosely held on this. I'm not convinced that they have a strong conviction on this. I think they have a sort of temporary enthusiasm because of the surround sound media that's encouraging them to think that way. I think if the surround sound were to be turned down, there would be mean reversion back to a First Amendment in this country. But the fact is this is not just the crazy kids being taught this by their high school and college professors. This is the actual upper echelon of the censorship industry's apex predators in the national security state itself. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. The head of the State Department's censorship arm from 2014 to 2016, and a guy who is on the board of NewsGuard, Rick Stengel. He was a guy who is the Undersecretary for Public Affairs at the State Department. That's the #3 position there. He self-described himself as Obama's, quote, propagandist in chief while he was at the State Department, ran the Global Engagement Center, which was the main scandal of the State Department for the Twitter files. And he was the former managing editor of Time magazine and described himself as a free speech maximalist. He testified that his job at State while he was working for the Obama administration was to export the First Amendment around the globe. And then 2 years later, Donald Trump wins the 2016 election, powered by free speech on social media. And Rick Stengel does the world's most gruesome 180 you've ever seen. He published a op-ed in the Washington Post calling for an end to the First Amendment, and then followed up with an entire book about why the First Amendment needs to be done away with because social media results in the wrong people getting elected. And that guy, again, is now on the board of NewsGuard, the censorship sentinel that we've covered previously with the head of the CIA, head of the NSA, four-star general, head of DHS, head of the State Department censorship cell, and the head of NATO, all on the board of this major censorship sentinel. But it's beyond that, too. I mean, one of the things that my foundation has coming out at foundationforfreedomonline.com is a multi-part report on Stanford planning sessions, this very network we were talking about, where they openly called and plotted a way to potentially end the First Amendment in this country in order to secure federal government protection for the censorship industry. And on top of that, you had the Biden administration's lawyers themselves in the main Supreme Court case, Missouri v. Biden, at the appellate court level, argue that the First Amendment's classical interpretation has to be expanded in light of social media. So you have the Biden administration's own lawyers, you have the top censorship thought leaders in the censorship industry, and you have the apex predators of the national security state, all calling for an end to the First Amendment. This is a fight that is now existential.
So going into we got a couple of minutes left before the segment breaks, Mike. But 2024 elections, what are you seeing? What do you think is going to happen based on what you've seen the last couple of elections, midterms and generals, with regards to this issue? What's big tech moving towards on coming up to November?
Yep. So our Foundation for Freedom Online, has published a bunch of internal documents of major censorship industry thought leaders on what their plan is to censor the 2024 election. If it's heartening to hear, they are not overjoyed about the state of things. The House flipping to Republican, the scrutiny around their funding, the lawsuits, the bad press that they've suffered, the drying up of funding in certain respects, and the flipping of Twitter to Elon Musk, and the firing of the election integrity team there with Aaron Roderick's, who was recruiting from all these CIA hot zones for his election integrity team, had left them very depressed and dejected. And they regrouped by basically focusing on two new strategies in order to reinstall the level of censorship that we saw in the 2020 election. One of them is, with their loss of legitimacy at the federal government, they're moving into the state government. So this involves states like California, New York, Illinois, Rhode Island, and others passing these mandates for media literacy, which is a whole other bag of worms around forced censorship of media institutions that NewsGuard says are low information integrity. Mm-hmm. Literally, NewsGuard is leading this media literacy push, this national security state, den of vipers that we were just covering. But they've forced, as a matter of law at the states, mandatory media literacy in all K through 12 schools, which shoves tens of millions of dollars of funding into the censorship industry to reinflate their capacity to do things like election censorship. But the big one that they're focusing on in terms of specific takedowns is they have worked very closely with the EU on the new EU disinformation laws with the Digital Services Act. NewsGuard had a formal partnership with the European Union in constructing and doing the code of practice for these new EU laws, which are the number one existential threat to Elon Musk's ability to keep X free. The EU is a larger market than the US. It's 450 million people, as opposed to only 300 million, some here in the US. And if they get kicked out of the EU, that is existential to Twitter's ability to hold itself out as a global speech platform. It would be completely devastating, and it would shift all the leverage to places like Threads, the Facebook CIA intermediated Twitter alternative, and to other social media platforms like YouTube that X is now competing with on video. So they need to stay in the European market. And this new law compels them to censor what the EU deems disinformation, or else give the EU 6% of global annual revenue, which is, an unbelievable proportion. It may even be higher than the proportions of the profit margin of Twitter itself. So it's either bankrupt or go bankrupt, like lose your global market, or turn yourself over to the CIA and MI6 and Brussels NATO censorship mechanism. So that is the horns of the dilemma that X is on right now. And what's so troubling about this is not coming from the EU. This is coming from the US and London, in the sense that I've watched all these people for years run this exact same play when they did Transatlantic Flank Attack 1.0 to get Europe to pass censorship laws like Germany's NetzDG in 2017. If you go to my Twitter at Mike Ben Cyber, you'll see I've posted all about this. Just type in the keywords Transatlantic Flank Attack. You'll see the whole history of this. They're doing it again, Transatlantic Flank Attack 2.0, where you had these US State Department officials and these creepy crawlies from the Stanford Internet Observatory and other CIA intermediated cutouts for the US government who get government funding, who all plotted the ways to use Europe's censorship laws to compel censorship of the 2024 election. This is a boomerang to use our foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks to censor U.S. elections, and frankly, the whole thing needs to be interrogated from top to bottom.
Yeah, the European Digital Services Act in Brussels is just a convenient single entry point for Washington to micromanage political, geopolitical, economic affairs in Europe. That's arguably why the EU was formed to begin with, some might say. But Mike Benz, foundationforfreedomonline.com, we really appreciate you joining us and raising awareness on these important issues here on TNT, Today's News Talk.
Thank you, Patrick.
Do follow Mike Ben Cyber on X, Twitter, plus great website, foundationforfreedomonline.com. It's got a lot of resources there, and all the details of what we're talking about are on his website. So you do want to follow that and share that. We'll drop that link in the TNT chat community as well. We've got good numbers in there today. Great to see you guys. We're going to break right now and go to our roving correspondent for an update on the Middle East, Basil Valentine, joining us on the other side. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We'll be right back.
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNT.